Hey everybody, welcome to the 2024 installment of my questions and answers videos. As I mentioned last year, I decided to turn this into a yearly thing that I would do at the end of Requests Month every year, and now that we've gotten through February, well, here's the 2024 edition of it. If you have a question you want me to answer in next year's Q&A, go ahead and submit that however you feel comfortable doing so, whether it be a direct message or comment to this video or whatever. And of course, for those of you who support the channel on Patreon, you can always send it directly to me on there or reply in one of the weekly updates or whatever. And of course, if there is a particular name you would prefer me using, or you would actually prefer to remain anonymous when it comes to crediting the question, make sure to mention that so I can get it right when I make the Q&A. There are a few stipulations here. The first of them is, don't ask me to take a look at insert game here. Don't say, what do you think about insert game here? Because that's not a Q&A question, that is a review request. I'll go ahead and add it to the list if it's not on there already, and then of course I'll get to it in whatever other format is appropriate for it later on down the line. Now, of course, if you have something very specific to ask about a particular game, then that might be appropriate for your Q&A, but that's going to be more on a case-by-case basis. So go ahead and ask that, and I'll let you know whether or not it's something that I'll answer in a Q&A. The other thing I will not be answering in Q&As is political questions, because I'm sick of politics, you're sick of politics, let's just leave it at that. Now that all that information's out of the way, let me go ahead and mention that the gameplay footage you'll be seeing throughout this video is of various titles that I am working on videos for. They may not necessarily be full reviews, but they'll at the very least be the likes of my thoughts on videos or games that infuriate me to no end or something along those lines. So if you're curious about any of those, definitely stay tuned. Now then, we've got all the preamble out of the way, so let's go ahead and get things started with a question from, I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation of this, so just bear with me here. I think it's Balintgarai4618. If that's wrong, feel free to let me know. But it's a question that I've actually thought about a fair bit, which is, do you think you will ever review every game on the list? Every accepted game, that is. Obviously, you're not going to review denied ones. It's getting longer and longer, so how much do you think you're going to be able to get to before eventually having to stop for one reason or another? It's definitely a tricky subject, and the answer is a bit complicated. The first thing is going to be the simple reality that I can't review every single game on that list in my traditional one game per video, maybe including expansion pack format. Now that doesn't mean that format is going away, but it does mean that I'll need to make some adjustments depending on what I'm covering. For example, I'll definitely be needing to do a lot more multi-game my thoughts on videos if I want to cover everything in the list. There are just a lot of games in that list that it doesn't really make sense for me to do a full review or individual my thoughts on video on, because I just don't have that much to say about them individually, so it makes more sense to throw them all into one video. Of course, if you've been following my channel for a while, you probably know that format, so I don't really need to say too much about it, but I wanted to mention that I will be expanding that idea into some of my reviews. More specifically, there are certain games out there where it wouldn't necessarily make sense to review every single game individually, even if I can finish them all, but it does make sense to combine them all into one video. So to give you a few examples of what I mean, I am going to be reviewing every single game in the Painkiller series in the same video. Now to some of you that might be kind of an obvious thing, but you need to remember that the only actual expansion pack in there is Battle Out of Hell. That is the only one that actually requires one of the other games to function. It requires the original Painkiller. The rest of them are all standalone games, and of course Hell and Damnation is basically a remaster of the original. So when looking at the series as a whole, I could certainly review Painkiller along with Battle Out of Hell because that was Painkiller Black Edition, and then I could do individual reviews on all the other games in the series, and then of course on my thoughts on video for Hell and Damnation because that was basically a remaster of the original game. But since I felt like I would just be repeating myself an awful lot there, particularly with regards to things like the presentation, it just made a lot more sense to me to go ahead and combine them all into one video, and that way, when it comes to assessing each individual entry in the series, I can just devote entire sections of the video to focusing on the differences between those and all of the other games in the series, and then ultimately come to an assessment of what that particular game's quality is. Now, of course, as I'm recording this video, I'm not exactly sure how that's going to work out. It could be a really messy format, we'll just have to wait and see, but I figure it makes sense, and it's an idea that I can also apply to certain other series. Another example is the Cultures series, where the second, third, and fourth games in the series are so similar to one another that there's no point in making separate videos on each individual game, because the only significant differences between them are the campaigns, so it just makes more sense to combine them all into one video. The thing is, that one gets a bit trickier because the original Cultures falls in the classic category on my channel, meaning it was released prior to 2001. But the rest of the games were all released after 2001, so they're technically in separate categories. So I'm not entirely sure if I'm going to combine all 4 games into one video, or do a classic review on the original game and then a normal review on the second, third, and fourth game combined. But of course, we'll get there when we get there, and you are more than welcome to let me know what you think I should do in that particular instance, whether I should combine them all into one video, or do a single video on the original Cultures and then a second video that covers the second, third, and fourth games. So feel free to throw your thoughts on that particular idea in the comments below. But there are also some other series that I've been kind of struggling with what I should do with them. For example, the Exile and Avernum series, where the Avernum series is actually a remake of the Exile series, and between them you're dealing with a bunch of games that are considered classics on my channel, and then a bunch of games that are considered modern on my channel, and then as if that weren't confusing enough, Avernum 1, 2, and 3 got fairly recently remade again, so there's remakes of remakes, and it just gets complicated. I'm still not sure how I'm going to sort that one out, but I do know that some degree of combining various entries in those series together is going to happen. So it might get a bit complicated depending on the individual game series, but you can expect some degree of combining multiple games from a series into one video is going to start happening in the future, and so that'll take out chunks of the list all at once, but then what about the rest of it? Well, like I said, I'll be doing more multi-game My Thoughts on videos, and I will probably also be doing more My Thoughts on videos in general, and of course I will be doing more DW Plays videos as well, particularly in genres that don't necessarily interest me all that much, for example platformers or things like that. I might also mess around with formatting a bit and see if I can find something that's a bit more short form content than what I normally do, but we'll just have to wait and see how that goes. Of course, if you have any suggestions, then feel free to throw those at me as well. But to ultimately sum this one up here, do I see myself reviewing every game on the list? Well, I don't necessarily see myself reviewing every single game on the list, but I do plan to cover it on the channel at some point. Now that we've gone through that heavy question, let's answer a couple of questions from the Alan reviews. The first of which is, what keyboard and mouse do you use? Well, unfortunately, my keyboard was discontinued several years ago. It's a Corsair K95 RGB with Cherry MX Brown switches, and while Corsair does seem to still have a version of this available, it's not quite the same thing. They have a K95 RGB Platinum SE, which has the same layout, but it's got a gaudier color scheme on it, and it uses Cherry MX Speed switches instead of Cherry MX Brown switches, so I can't tell you how that keyboard is in comparison to the one I have, but I rather like the one I have. It's been working very well for me for the past several years, and hopefully it continues to do so for a long time. As for my mouse, it's a Logitech G403. Nothing fancy, but it gets the job done, and it gets it done very well. And the other question from the Alan Reviews is, what is a game you consider underrated or underappreciated? Well, there are a fair few of those. I mean, there's obviously stuff like Severance Blade of Darkness, which is just, unfortunately, not all that well known, but is an absolutely fantastic game. It is my gold standard for hack-and-slash games. And unfortunately, a lot of people just don't have the patience to put up with the controls long enough to learn how the game plays and really appreciate how great of a game it is. But then there's other stuff that might be a bit more controversial, like, say, Mass Effect Andromeda. If you've seen my review on that, then you know that I found the hate surrounding that game to be wildly overblown. It's not great, don't get me wrong, but it's nowhere near as bad as people make it out to be. And hey, while we're on the BioWare train, I might as well trigger all of the Dragon Age fans and point out that no, Dragon Age 2 is not terrible. It's a transition game, and while it doesn't nail that transition perfectly, it does address a fair few of the issues that the original game had in its gameplay mechanic department, which up to the point I'm making this Q&A have still prevented me from ever finishing the original Dragon Age more than once. Meanwhile, I have played through the entirety of Dragon Age 2 3 times. And that wasn't just because I was making a review of it, it was because I actually enjoyed it enough to play through it multiple times before I even got to the point of making the review. So yeah, if you wanted a bit of a controversial one there, Dragon Age 2, I think it's dramatically underrated. Anyway, let's move on to a bunch of questions from the Brodator, starting with, what is the most obscure game I've ever played? Well, that's a bit of a tricky one, because what do you mean by obscure? Do you just mean that nobody really knows much about it? Do you mean that it's not known in particular regions? It could mean a lot of different things. I mean, among my channel's viewership, most of us probably wouldn't consider the likes of the Gothic series to be obscure, but for a general gaming public, it is. And then, of course, there's stuff that's relatively well-known in, say, JRPG fan circles, like Mystic Arc or Bahamut Lagoon, but outside of those circles, they're really not known at all because they never released outside of Japan, and you have to dig up translation patches for them. Now, let's face it, when you say obscure, you mean the kind of thing where not only do I not really know what it is, but I can't even really find any information on it. Well, I do have a few games like that, and those are the games that I find the most interesting because, let's face it, not only is trying to find out more about them an adventure in and of itself, but if there's not really much information about them online, then being able to get through those games is another adventure, and sometimes it's tricky to even get the games working at all. I mean, there are a lot of games from the Windows 3.1 up through the 98 era that just don't work on modern operating systems, pretty much no matter what you do to them. Hell, sometimes they don't even necessarily work on the original hardware and operating systems they were made for. To give you a prime example of one of those, I have a copy of Westworld 2000, which is a first-person shooter very, very loosely based on the film Westworld. And no matter what I've tried to do to that thing, it just will not function, whether I try to run it in my Windows 98 virtual machine or on a modern operating system or what have you. But the stipulation in your question is the most obscure game I've ever played, and I haven't actually been able to play Westworld 2000. And so if we go by the games that I've actually played, more than just making sure my copy of the game boots up anyway, then a few games come to mind. If we're talking about demo versions, then there's Spec Ops Mission 2000, which I can find absolutely no information on whatsoever, other than the fact that it exists. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, the Spec Ops series is a bunch of, I use this term very loosely, tactical shooters, where apart from the first game, which was Rangers Lead the Way, along with its expansion pack, of course, and the second game, which was Green Beret, along with its expansion pack, the majority of the series is only available on console. There was Stealth Patrol, Airborne Commando, and Covert Assault, all of which were released on the PlayStation. And then the series was finally resurrected to some degree with the fairly recent Spec Ops The Line, which unfortunately is no longer available. I think there was some sort of licensing thing with music or something in it. And when that expired, of course, they had to pull the game from sale, so unfortunately you can't get Spec Ops The Line anymore, which means that the entire series is no longer available anymore. Not exactly surprising, given that the original games just don't work on modern operating systems and the rest of them are PlayStation games. But still, it's unfortunate that a piece of gaming history is kind of being lost there. But anyway, the point here is that there was a demo version of what they were titling Spec Ops Mission 2000, and from what I can tell, it was either an earlier build of Spec Ops 2 Green Beret that they released a demo of and then retitled it later, or it was meant to be a third game in the series, but they canceled it, and there's just no information that I can find on this thing at all, other than, again, the fact that it exists. Although I guess you could say the term exists is very loosely used there, because even the demo just doesn't work. It didn't even work on hardware and software of the time, let alone now, so I have no idea what's going on with Spec Ops Mission 2000, but it is about as obscure as it gets. But then, of course, there's the matter of it being only a demo version and the game never actually getting a full release. So if we're talking about games that have only been fully released and that I have played more than just making sure my copy of the game works, then probably Cybergenic Ranger, which was an absolutely atrocious platformer for DOS, and unfortunately I can't show you any gameplay footage of it because my copy of the game is on 5¼ inch floppies and I don't have a 5¼ inch floppy drive anymore. There are a few videos of it on YouTube, but the main one that you'll find if you look it up is the AGDQ 2020 speedrun of it that NPC did. And even though he basically just runs through the entire game, it gives you a pretty good impression of just how atrocious the game actually is. So if you're curious, I'll go ahead and throw a link to that either in the video description box or in the card things that come up on the screen there so you can get an idea of what that game's like. But yeah, it is one of the most obscure games in my collection, and also happens to be one of the worst games in my collection, so there you go. I should, however, note that it's probably not the most obscure game in my entire collection, but rather the most obscure game in my collection that I have actually played. So the answer to this question might end up changing later on down the line when I get around to messing around with some of those games, but for now, the most obscure is probably Cybergenic Ranger. Moving on to the next question from the Brodator, which is, has there ever been a scene in a game, movie, or book that was so disgusting that it made you nauseous? Not really, and the main reason for it is that the main things that make me nauseous are if I just eat something that disagrees with me, or if I try to read or play a video game while I'm moving in a car. Specifically a car. I can do it in airplanes and trains just fine, but for whatever reason, in cars, I get motion sick if I try to read or play a video game. Beyond those scenarios, about the only thing that will make me nauseous is if I smell something particularly foul, and I'm not going to get that from a video game, book, or movie. So while I have run across plenty of things that are disturbing or unsettling, there hasn't really been anything that was so disgusting it made me nauseous. Unless, of course, you count something like the Matrix level from Tech War, but that's an entirely different kind of disgusting. Anyway, moving on to the next question from Brodator, which is my favorite animated movie. You know, this is actually kind of a funny question, and the answer to it will probably surprise you a bit. Because at first I was thinking about answering it in a similar way to answering the typical what's your favorite game of all time thing, which is you really need to break that down much further in category for me to be able to give you some kind of an answer there. But in this particular case, the first thing that came to mind was Ghost in the Shell, the original version from the 90s, of course, not the 2.0, which was kind of ruining the whole thing. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it's actually kind of a toss-up between Ghost in the Shell and the 1977 Rankin and Bass production of The Hobbit. I mean, sure, it's not exactly the most accurate adaptation of the book. I mean, the book is one of my favorites as well. In fact, I actually enjoy it considerably more than I enjoy the Lord of the Rings trilogy. But the Rankin and Bass production just has this charm about it. It really captures the whimsy that I felt reading the book. Especially in the soundtrack, which is very 70s folk, and it just works really well. So if you haven't seen the Rankin and Bass production of The Hobbit, well worth watching. Moving on to the last question we have in this Q&A from the Brodator, which is the worst movie I've ever seen. Well, it kind of depends on what you mean by worst, so I'll go with the movie that just drives me up the wall, the one that I hate the most, which is the Romeo and Juliet film starring Leonardo DiCaprio. That one has the double whammy of me not only despising the source material, but also despising what they did with the source material. So yeah, the less I have to think about that, the better. Now then, let's move on to a question from Templario X32, which is, which movie do I think has the best writing I've ever seen? Well, I'm not going to count things that are adapted from novels, so stuff like The Godfather is out, even though The Godfather is great, don't get me wrong. And I also won't be counting things that are adapted from stage productions, so of course stuff like Shakespeare's out. And technically that also means that Casablanca's out. I know a lot of people cite that as the absolute best movie ever written, but it's adapted from a stage production, not actually an original screenplay. So if we discount all those, what do we get? Well, I'm inclined to say either Citizen Kane or Chinatown. I know those are probably kind of cliche options for best writing in a movie, but what I find is that writing in most movies actually is on the more middling side of things at best, and it's other aspects of the movie like the cinematography, the action sequences, things like that, that elevate it well beyond what the writing is actually capable of achieving. And if you're looking for movies that emphasize the writing more than other aspects, you're probably looking at stuff that was adapted from various print media. So that more or less covers that. So let's go ahead and move on to a question from, I'm guessing you pronounce this Hello Kala, but I'm not 100% sure. And that is, what is your opinion of the history and current state of video game storytelling and writing? What are the games with stories that stuck with you the most, the ones which you hated, and what trends in video game storytelling do you like or dislike? Well, the weird thing about this particular question is I actually don't have all that much to say here, because video game writing has stayed more or less constant from the very beginning on up through now. It takes a lot of its cues in terms of storytelling from movies and TV shows, and for most types of games that actually works fine. Where things get a bit trickier is when you start implementing more player agency, and that's going to be more the realm of stuff like role-playing games, where video game developers haven't really figured out the best way of doing that yet. They've figured out ways that do work, don't get me wrong. I mean, there's plenty of player agency in plenty of role-playing games. But we haven't quite hit the point where you have the level of reactivity you get from the likes of, say, a dungeon master when you play Dungeons & Dragons with a group of people. Because you are collaboratively storytelling at that point. You say something, and then the other players respond, the DM responds, and you build that story together. We don't really have that kind of thing in a video game yet. We do have reactivity, we do have situations where you can make a choice as your character, and then that plays out differently from if you had made a different decision, and that's all well and good, but that's ultimately a hard limit of what we currently understand as far as video games are concerned. As for the other aspects of this question, well, stories that I absolutely despise ties in with the trends in video game storytelling that I really dislike, which is, well, just throw a dart at basically anything that is labeled JRPG, and you're gonna hit a story I probably can't stand. Everything from constantly using amnesia as a storytelling device, to the power scaling being completely bonkers, where you start out fighting the most lowly of vermin, and then at the end of it you're fighting God, because why the hell not? To the downright excessive amounts of cringe-inducing melodrama, to the fact that because so-called JRPGs are drawing on typical Japanese fiction writing, usually from the likes of light novels and such like that, the pacing is just absolutely atrocious, because that's how Japanese fiction generally is. Everything is just dragged out to an absolutely ludicrous degree, to the point where you kind of forget why you're even bothering in the first place, because you just lose track of what's going on by the time they finally get to the friggin' point. So yeah, if you can count all that as storytelling trends, then those tend to drive me up the wall. As for individual games with stories that I absolutely despised, well, one of them that immediately comes to mind I'm going to do an entire separate video on, and that'll probably be a fairly spicy video because that is one of the few games out there that I hate so much I want it erased from existence. So I'm not going to reveal that one here, but stay tuned, it's on the way eventually, it's just going to take a while. But the thing about video games in general is that even if the story is really, really awful, the gameplay can kind of cancel that out. So even in games where the story is terrible, a lot of times I'll remember the gameplay of it more than the actual story, so I won't necessarily remember immediately how awful the story was until I go back and take another look at it and go, oh yeah, that story was terrible. But as for a few of the others that I can think of off the top of my head, obviously there's stuff like Ride to Hell Retribution, which is just so terrible all around that, well, it's so far as the only 0 out of 5 on my scale, so there you go there. But then there's other stuff like Fire Emblem Fates. Now, I like the Fire Emblem series, but the writing has never really been one of its strongest suits, apart from a couple of very rare exceptions in the series. And while most of the series just falls into the very middling range of writing, the writing in Fates is... Okay, let me put it this way. Up until Fire Emblem Awakening, the art style of the Fire Emblem series had always clearly been inspired by manga or anime aesthetics, but it wasn't really heavy into that. It was still relatively grounded. And while the writing certainly leaned into some Japanese fantasy tropes, it never really delved into what I would term as cringy anime bullshit until Fire Emblem Awakening rolled around. But even in Awakening, they still didn't go quite full bore with it. There's definitely plenty of cringy anime bullshit in it, don't get me wrong. But if we use the metaphor of stepping into a pool of water, the series up to Awakening was more dipping your toes, or maybe up to your ankles at absolute worst, in the cringy anime bullshit. Whereas with Awakening, it's more like maybe knee or mid-thigh level on the cringy anime bullshit. And then Fates happened. And rather than just staying at roughly mid-thigh level, or even just wading in slightly more, maybe up to hip level, now this time when they went up to the cringy anime bullshit pool, they dived into the deep end head first. The only other games in the series where they've done that are Fire Emblem Heroes, which is the mobile gacha game, so I don't really count that one, and Fire Emblem Engage, which is the most recently released one for the Switch. And while I definitely do count that one, and frankly the writing in it is even worse than Fates, which is just baffling to think about, at least the marketing material for it made it pretty clear that the game was really just an excuse to bring some classic Fire Emblem characters into a modern game without, I don't know, actually doing them any justice, like, say, localizing Mystery of the Emblem, Genealogy of the Holy War, Thrakia 776, and The Binding Blade, like we have been begging them to do for decades at this point. Nope, can't do that, gotta just shoehorn the classic characters into a new game with absolutely cringe-inducing characters because I don't really know, I guess because Fire Emblem Heroes was doing pretty well, so they figured they'd just take that idea and mix it with actual main series stuff and Engage as the result. Whatever the reason, the writing in Fire Emblem Fates and Fire Emblem Engage is atrocious, and they're some of the first things I think of when I think of stories that I hated. As for ones that really stuck with me, well, that actually bleeds into the next question a bit, so I'll go ahead and bring that question up, which is from someone who preferred to remain anonymous, and that is, has any game made me cry? Now, if you mean full-on ugly crying, tears flowing, just sobbing mess, no. You've probably figured this out by now if you've watched my channel for a while, but I'm not an especially emotive person. That doesn't mean I don't feel things, I certainly do, it's just that I internalize them more than I display any kind of outward signs that I'm actually feeling anything. If something manages to overflow the buffer, so to speak, then it might manifest in tearing up a bit, but those tears almost never actually fall, and weirdly enough, if I'm tearing up, it's usually because my allergies are acting up, not because I'm actually feeling anything. But what might be a bit more noticeable is if I'm having a particularly emotional response to something, then I might get choked up a bit. It's rare that any piece of media will do that to me, whether it's movies, TV, books, music, or, of course, video games. But the video game that immediately comes to mind when I think of ones that actually did choke me up and provoke a significant emotional response, To the Moon. Now, unfortunately, my only video on To the Moon is old and terrible, and I probably should remake it at some point. In fact, I probably will remake it at some point. But to give you a bit of a primer on it, it's a narrative game that Freebird Games built in RPG Maker, and it tells the story of a couple of technicians from a company that is in the business of fulfilling last wishes in the form of implanting memories in terminally ill patients when they're at their last moments. And so in this game you play as the two technicians for this company who are going to fulfill the last wishes of a patient who tells them that he wants to go to the moon. The tricky thing there is that he doesn't know why he wants to go to the moon, just that he really wants to go to the moon. And so throughout the course of the game, you are sifting through this dying man's fractured memories in an attempt to discover why he wants to go to the moon, and ultimately fulfill his last wish. And obviously, I don't want to spoil the story for you, but even just remembering it is actually getting me choked up a bit, because to put it quite simply, it is just a beautiful, well-written, heartfelt story, and I very highly recommend you check it out if you're willing to put up with the jankiness of the RPG Maker engine, and the fact that it is a narrative game with very little going on in terms of gameplay. So if that sounds fine to you, then definitely pick up To the Moon, because it is wonderful. And if you like To the Moon, then you'll probably enjoy its follow-up, which is Finding Paradise, along with its prequel mini-sode A Bird Story. Although A Bird Story was made as a sort of experimental interactive movie kind of thing, rather than a proper game like To the Moon and Finding Paradise are, so your mileage will probably vary a lot more with A Bird Story than Finding Paradise, but if you want the full effect of Finding Paradise, you do need to experience A Bird Story as well, so I would recommend Even if you're not especially enthused about it, go through A Bird Story first, then go through Finding Paradise. You'll probably find it more rewarding in the long run that way. There's also an additional follow-up to that one called Imposter Factory, and while I do have a copy of it, I haven't gotten around to going through it yet. So I can't personally vouch for Imposter Factory yet, but I will do a video on it eventually whenever I get around to going through it, so keep an eye out for that one eventually. But yeah, to bring it back to the question here, again, I'm not a very emotive person, so doing like a full ugly cry is just not something that happens to me. But in terms of making me choke up and tear up quite a bit, To the Moon absolutely did that, and it did it the most effectively out of every game that I've ever played. And as such, I really can't recommend it enough. Aside from that, though, the only other games I can think of off the top of my head that came close to provoking that level of emotional response in me are Bastion and Transistor. Funnily enough, Bastion is another one of those games where the video I made on it is old and terrible, and I should definitely go back and remake the video. But both were made by Supergiant Games, and while they are very different games from one another, they're both absolutely fantastic, and I very highly recommend both. So I think that more or less covers that question, so let's move on to a few questions from Timed Raven 117, starting with a couple that are going to follow the narrative in games discussion that we've been having here for the past couple of questions. With narrative in video games, how much is enough for various genres? For example, I feel all but the most simple of games are only half complete without a narrative, and that any gaming experience is massively improved with competent writing and storytelling complementing the gameplay loop. The funny part is that this is kind of a loaded question because you say how much is enough for various genres, and the answer is always, in every instance, it depends. Because just saying how much is enough for insert genre here isn't always the best way of handling the question. Sometimes you play a game and the story is better if it's longer because it has more time to develop the characters, to develop the actual plot itself, to develop the world. Sometimes you don't really need any of that, and you can just condense everything down to a much larger degree, and that actually ends up working better. But while those are obviously going to depend entirely on the individual plots in those individual games, there's also the gameplay loops themselves to consider, and if those overstay their welcome, then your plot's probably too long, or there's just too much filler content. By the same token, if the plot ends, and thus the game ends, and you feel like you haven't gotten the most out of the gameplay that you really could, you probably don't have enough narrative in there. But unfortunately, that's about as specific as the question really gets in terms of just a general sense. A genre will impose a few expectations and give you some allowances. For example, if you're playing a role-playing game, you know it's probably going to be longer and it's going to be slower paced, so it's not that weird if it hasn't really clicked for you within the first, say, 3 or 4 hours. It might take up to 5 or 6 hours to really get into a role-playing game. But that doesn't mean you should just pack an RPG with tons of narrative and call it a day. It's not that simple. Meanwhile, if you're playing an action game, you expect those to be shorter and be much easier to get into in a very short amount of time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that a bunch of narrative is just straight up unwelcome there. Sometimes you get action games that do have plenty of narrative, and it actually ends up working out in its favor. It just depends. And I hate being that wishy-washy on an answer, but unfortunately I have to be in this particular case. Because it's not necessarily how much narrative you have, it's what you do with it. Moving on to the next question, we have, what do I think about the gameplay and narrative evolution in the Assassin's Creed series? They go on to say that they personally feel it became too arcade-focused and monetization adapted to the point it's not even the same game series anymore. Well, yeah, it's definitely not the same series anymore. I mean, it started out life as an attempt at a combination of action-adventure and stealth, and the further into the series you go, the more it drops the stealth aspect, and the more it just turns into Ubisoft's generic action-adventure series. Presumably because they're afraid that if they tried to take the action-adventure gameplay style and move it into its own separate series, that is perhaps a brand new IP, that it would be something vaguely resembling a Risk, so they just decide to tack on the Assassin's Creed name because, hey, brand recognition. But as for the so-called narrative evolution, it really hasn't evolved in any discernible way. It's just coasted along this entire time. But as for gameplay evolution, I mean, there was evolution between the first game on up through the Ezio trilogy, and to a far lesser extent, Assassin's Creed 3, But once you get past that, they more or less just took the same ideas they already had and maybe did a bit of refinement here and there, but just coasted along with that for quite a while. And then they finally changed things up dramatically with Assassin's Creed Origins, but by changing things up dramatically, they turned it into Ubisoft's generic action-adventure series, and, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that Origins, Odyssey, and Valhalla are bad games. I haven't gotten around to Odyssey or Valhalla yet, so I can't speak for those personally, but Origins certainly isn't a bad game, but it doesn't really feel like an Assassin's Creed game at all, at least if you've played the previous games. And with the recent release of Assassin's Creed Mirage being closer, at least, to the original vision of the series, it makes me wonder if Ubisoft has any idea what they're actually doing with the franchise. It seems like they really don't. I mean, think about how long they have gone in the so-called Assassin's Creed series without setting one of the major games in Japan and having the player be a ninja. That should have been the most painfully obvious thing for them to do with this series, but they have still not done it, and it is baffling. So yeah, I don't really think that Assassin's Creed has so much evolved as Ubisoft has just thrown a bunch of stuff at the wall and hoped that some of it stuck, and well, some of it did stick, but most of it really didn't. Moving on from the narrative discussion, we have the question of what do I think is the importance of having a good development team in video game development? The context of this being that over the past several years, a lot of major releases have just been a complete dumpster fire, and a lot of seemingly legendary studios have just kind of been falling apart over the past several years. Obviously, having a good development team is incredibly important, but all the talent in the world can't save you if your project is horrendously mismanaged, and that's what we've really been seeing with the past several years of video game development. Management of the studios and the projects within those studios has just been absolutely horrendous, and the effects have been quite obvious, from having to delay games, to them releasing in broken and buggy states, to just being blatantly unfinished, all manner of things like that. And of course, all of that has an incredibly demoralizing effect on the staff of the studios, so you end up with a lot of veteran developers at those studios either leaving the industry entirely, or leaving those studios to go either form their own studios or join other studios where working conditions are considerably better. And so these horribly mismanaged studios and projects are left with a bunch of rookie developers who don't really know what they're doing yet, and the results are pretty obvious. That's not to say that these rookie developers with the appropriate training and management couldn't put out absolutely fantastic products. They certainly might be capable of doing so. So while a really good development team is certainly very important, what's arguably more important is good management, and unfortunately a lot of studios just don't have that anymore. And considering how horrendously corporatized the AAA space is, I really don't see that improving much anytime soon. Now then, moving on to the final question from TimedRaven117 for this particular Q&A, which is, I know you said no politics, but I must ask, pineapple on pizza, should the death penalty apply? So here's the funny thing about the way you've worded this question. First, you've acted like it's a political question when it's not. And you've also acted like putting pineapple on pizza is a crime. And that's not quite accurate, because putting pineapple on pizza is an atrocity. Pizza is not supposed to be sweet. To put something as absurdly sweet as pineapple on a pizza is to invite chaos and devastation into this world. It is to deliberately align yourself with the most evil powers in the universe. It is something that will immediately damn you to the special circle of hell specifically reserved for people who put pineapple on pizza. And there is no mortal punishment sufficient to deal with such a crime against everything good and wonderful in this world as putting pineapple on pizza. In all seriousness, though, pineapple on pizza is absolutely disgusting and is definitely a crime against pizza. Again, pizza is supposed to be savory, it is not supposed to be sweet, and putting something that ridiculously sweet on a pizza turns it into something that is not pizza. As for the rest of your question of my favorite pizza toppings, my favorite combination, which I unfortunately don't get to eat a whole lot of, is salami, spicy sausage, onions, and both black and green olives. And of course, tomato-based sauce, can't have too much of that, and plenty of cheese, preferably multiple types of cheese. And in case you're wondering, I generally prefer thinner crusts as well. Moving on to a question from Cy S. If you had the chance to make a World War I single-player first-person shooter, what would that look like? Well, the first thing is that it would need to be historically accurate. Not overwhelmingly so to the point where it's basically a mill sim, but things like the uniforms, the equipment loadouts, the actual makeup of the armies themselves, that sort of thing, would need to be rather accurate. And then the actual gameplay, weirdly enough, would look an awful lot like the intro level to Battlefield 1, where you play as one soldier fighting through a battle, and then when that character dies, because World War I and World War I's a meat grinder, it's not actually game over. Instead, it switches over to the perspective of a different soldier, and the battle continues. Would that work out? I have no idea, but I think it'd be really cool, so I really hope a studio does something along those lines. Moving on to a few questions from Mitchell G, starting with, you mentioned before that you don't care much for South Park. Do you have something specific against it, or it's just not working for me? Well, this one's pretty simple and straightforward. Apart from the World of Warcraft episode, which is actually very amusing, I just don't find South Park very funny at all. I certainly appreciate the satire aspect of it and the fact that they are willing to push a lot of buttons that other shows just aren't. But I just don't find its style of humor very funny, so I just don't watch it. Next question, did you watch the Stargate TV shows? Not in their entirety. I did watch the movie, but as far as the TV shows are concerned, I never finished any of them. But I have seen a decent chunk of all three of the main TV series, so SG-1, Atlantis, and Universe. Universe kinda sucked, honestly, but the other two were okay. They had their moments here and there, but by and large, I just preferred other TV shows and just didn't really watch them that much. Next question, have I ever looked into UFOs or aliens in any way, such as books, magazines, or documentaries, or I'm just familiar with it through pop culture, such as flying saucers, gray aliens, etc.? Well, obviously I have some personal experience being a horrifying eldritch monstrosity, but in terms of the UFOs and aliens you're referring to, no, I haven't really gone out of my way to look into that very much. I have seen the odd episode of Ancient Aliens here or there, and it's usually so stupid it makes me laugh. But apart from that, the subject just doesn't really interest me all that much, so I don't really look into it. Next question, which countries have I visited so far? Well, obviously I'm from the US, so I guess you can technically count that. But I've also been to Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Liechtenstein, Switzerland, Austria, and technically the UK, although I didn't really visit there as much as I just briefly stopped there on my way somewhere else. Next question, what do I think about health bars in action games? It's pretty much a meme at this point that whenever you come across a boss-type enemy, a giant health bar pops up above it, and now many games do that for the other NPCs too. Mitchell goes on to say that it's rather immersion-breaking in first-person shooters, for example. And I guess if you think about it, health bars in various games are kind of silly, but I just got used to them, so I don't really care one way or another about it. Generally, it is better to have more information rather than less, so for example, a health bar is really useful in determining whether you're actually doing any damage to an enemy or not, but I certainly wouldn't say it's essential for enemies to have health bars or anything like that. The player definitely needs some sort of health gauge, whether that's a health bar or a number or whatever. You need to know how much health you have as a player, but otherwise I just view it as completely optional. Next question, and the last one from Mitchell G for this particular video. Do I have a HOTAS setup, or do I plan on getting one? I do actually have a HOTAS setup. It's a Logitech X52 Professional, and unfortunately I don't get as much of an opportunity to use it as I'd really like, because getting it set up to work properly with a lot of the older games I have that I would want to use it on, like say X-Wing and TIE Fighter and all that, don't really like modern controllers. One of these days I'll sit down and figure the whole mess out, but that'll be after I catch up on a bunch of other projects, so who knows when that'll be. Next question is from Holy Goof, and it's approximately how much of my time do I spend on retro games and how much on modern games? They go on to define retro as, let's say, before 2006. Well, we'll go by the category that I use, which is 2001 onwards for modern and 2000 and earlier for classic or retro. Honestly, I don't really keep track of how much time I spend in classic games versus modern games, but if I had to guess, because there's just more modern games that I cover on the channel, I end up spending a lot more time on those. So we'll say probably 60-70% of my time is spent on modern games just because I cover them more on the channel than I cover retro games on the channel. But the simple reality is that it can vary pretty wildly. Sometimes I might be playing almost exclusively classic games, sometimes I might play almost exclusively modern games. It just depends on whatever I happen to be working on for the channel and what I happen to be in the mood for. Next up, we have a bunch of questions from Brendan H, and we're going to start with, what is the first video game I ever played, and how much did it impact me? So technically a two-part question there. And I have a feeling the answer to both is going to be a bit underwhelming to you, but it would have been Pong, and as far as how much it impacted me, basically not at all. It was other games that I played after that had a considerably bigger effect on me, particularly stuff like graphic adventure games such as the King's Quest series. So yeah, maybe not necessarily the answer you were expecting, but that's how it was. Next question. I'm very vocal in my distaste towards Bethesda Game Studios with the Fallout franchise. In my opinion, do I believe Fallout would have been handled better if Interplay still held the rights, or would it be worse? Well, if Interplay still held the rights, then the series probably would have ended with the console game Fallout Brotherhood of Steel. As it exists now, Interplay is really just a holding company. They hang on to the copyrights of various games that they've published over the years, and they allow them to be distributed through sites such as GOG and Steam. But while that's certainly a good thing for games preservation, unfortunately, they haven't really done anything new in a very long time. So sure, I have absolute disdain for the pathetic drivel that Bethesda craps out and calls Fallout, and I'm sure the upcoming TV show will be an absolute disaster as well. But on the positive side, we did get Fallout New Vegas out of the rights being sold to Bethesda, so at least there's that. And speaking of, because I know this will probably come up, I'm not entirely sure enough of the old development team is still at Obsidian to be able to pull off another Fallout game and actually have it be good. In case you can't tell, The Outer Worlds really shook my trust in the studio, and with them being acquired by Microsoft, I'm not entirely sure how things are going to go in the future. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see whether Obsidian still got it, but if anybody else could handle the Fallout IP properly, it would probably be In Exile Entertainment, but the thing is, they already have their own post-apocalyptic role-playing game franchise, which, funnily enough, Fallout was originally a spiritual successor for. So I don't really see much benefit in them picking up the Fallout IP other than just brand recognition, because Wasteland was already the spiritual predecessor to Fallout, in case you didn't know. And not only were Wasteland 2 and 3 fantastic, they were also pretty much what I was looking for from a proper styled Fallout game, and if a modern Fallout game were to release in that style, I'm pretty sure it would flop because the fan base for Fallout has basically been replaced with people who just think it's a first-person shooter series more than anything else. Meanwhile, us fans of OG Fallout have more or less accepted we're never going to get a proper Fallout game again, and so it's better to just consider the Fallout IP lost and just move on to something else, which is really unfortunate and depressing to say, but that's the unfortunate reality of it. Obviously, I am not completely discounting the idea that suddenly Bethesda will come to their senses, but let's be honest here. They haven't made a proper role-playing game in about 2 decades at this point, and that's not going to change anytime soon. Now then, moving on to the next question. What is my opinion regarding the recent delisting of several games, such as Battlefield Bad Company 2, the entire Unreal and Unreal Tournament series, and Ubisoft controversies? I'm assuming you mean stuff like The Crew. Do I feel like this will have a greatly negative impact on the gaming industry, especially with the games-as-a-service model? If so, how do I think the industry should improve? Well, here's the thing. I'm going to make a separate video on the whole live service thing, because it deserves its own separate rant. But as for what's relevant to this particular question, delisting games is nothing new. We've seen this kind of thing time and time again over the years, especially with games that use things like licensed music, where the licensing agreements with that music will expire, and because it would be so horribly cost ineffective to renew those music licenses, they end up pulling the games from sale. Now sure, the actual blame for that can probably be laid squarely at the feet of the music industry rather than the games industry, but it's still the most common instance we see of games being delisted. As for other games that get delisted, things can be a lot more complicated. The most common reason we see games delisted is that they use licensed music and the license for that music expires. At this point, the developer and publisher have basically 3 options. The first of them is to renew the license and just keep the game up. On the one hand, effectively nothing changes for the consumer in this instance. On the other hand, the company that made the game or publishes the game needs to pay a substantial licensing fee. And if the game's revenue isn't enough to justify that substantial licensing fee, then most likely they're going to just pull the game from sale because it's more cost effective for them to do that. So option 1 is pay the licensing fee and keep the game up, which again is not very cost effective. Option 2, pull the game from sale. What's option 3? Either remove or replace the music. And of course, that is going to compromise whatever vision the game originally set out with. So more often than not, you're not going to see a developer or publisher do that. And while you could say that it's really frustrating that the developers and publishers let themselves get into a situation like that, at least you can understand the decision of just dropping the game from sale entirely if it's just not cost effective for them to keep paying the licensing fee to keep the game in circulation when they're just not really getting any sales anymore. But understanding it doesn't make the practice any better. Next scenario, the licensing agreement for the game itself expires. We see this with the likes of the Lord of the Rings games. Various developers and publishers had licenses to make games set in this universe, and then after those licenses expired, those games just aren't available anymore. Same kind of thing that happened with the music situation, only it's with a licensed property in general. Whether it be a book, movie, TV show, comic series, whatever. And again, you can understand the business decision there, but it's still an unfortunate practice. Next scenario, games with multiplayer components or are entirely online that get pulled from sale and their servers shut down. This one is the most relevant to the question you're asking, because most of these games that have been pulled from sale in the last few years have been either live service games or multiplayer focused or entirely multiplayer games that have been around for a long time, and they just finally decided to shut them down and pull the games from sale. Now, in some cases, it's understandable why they do this, although it is still very unfortunate. In the case of entirely multiplayer games, the main cost is going to be all of the infrastructure keeping that game running. Maintaining the servers and the netcode and constantly pushing updates to the game to make sure not only it continues to function, but also various balance changes are made and so on and so forth, builds up expenses over time. In the case of particularly large games like, say, MMOs, that is a very large cost. This is why you have things like subscription fees, for example. Obviously, in the case of most MMOs these days, that has fallen very much out of favor, but there are still a few holding on to the subscription model, and you can think of that subscription fee as follows. A chunk of that goes into just pure maintenance costs of keeping the game up and running, and anything that doesn't go specifically into maintaining all of the infrastructure for the game then goes into whatever else the studio needs to allocate it towards. Funding for new projects, licensing fees, staff payments, whatever it may well be. And even games that don't use the subscription model are going to be doing something similar. Whenever you buy microtransactions, a chunk of that goes into maintaining the servers and infrastructure for the game, and then whatever's left is allocated to whatever the studio needs to allocate it towards. Regardless of the monetization model being used, as long as enough revenue is coming in for that particular game, it justifies not only keeping the game up and running, but putting out updates for the game to put in extra content and such. But once the revenue stream drops enough to where they can really only maintain a skeleton crew working on the game and continuing to keep the server infrastructure up and running, it will enter a period of what people will often refer to as maintenance mode, where the game stays up and running and it makes enough to keep the servers up and running, but it doesn't really make enough to fund further development of the game, so the only people still working on it are basically the skeleton crew just maintaining everything. The thing is that what I've just described is actually a gross oversimplification of everything that goes into maintaining these games, because it's not just the infrastructure itself, not just the servers and the netcode. It's also various engine issues that weren't a problem when the game originally released, but over time, with additional windows and driver updates and things like that, start to become more and more of a problem. So you basically need to go in and fix it on an engine level if you want to keep the game running. And sometimes it might not even be something about the game's engine or the way that it's coded, it might actually be just something in the middleware that the game uses that either suddenly starts to cause problems or it just ceases to function entirely. I mean, think about when GameSpy shut down about a decade ago at this point now, and suddenly online for a huge variety of games just stopped working because it all went through GameSpy. But regardless of whether the game starts suffering from middleware problems or game engine problems especially, eventually the cost of maintaining the game is going to exceed the revenue that they make from it. At that point, it is no longer economically viable for the company to continue supporting that game, and at that point they have one of three options available. The first of them is to sell the game to some other company. They make a bit of money on the transfer, probably not a whole lot, and then that becomes the other company's problem. Second option, they shut down all of that online infrastructure, which makes the game unplayable, and then they pull the game from sale because there's no way of playing it anymore. Third option, and the most rare of these, they turn the game over to the community so that it becomes the community's problem to support it. Now, obviously, the best solution for keeping the game up and running and allowing people to play it is going to be the community solution, but almost no developers and publishers are ever going to go for that, because a community-run version of the game would compete with any kind of sequel offering or spin-off offering or something along those lines that the company themselves might be producing in the future. And unfortunately, it's considered more lucrative for them to just sit on the IP and do basically nothing with it than it is for them to turn some level of control over it to the community. Thus, we end up in another situation where it's understandable why these particular types of online games eventually get shut down and pulled from sale, even though it still absolutely sucks. And if you bring console games into the mix there, things get even more complicated, because not only do you have the server infrastructure for those specific games, but you also have all of the infrastructure and middleware and such on the consoles themselves, and if the console manufacturer decides to stop supporting the online infrastructure and stop supporting the digital storefront and all that sort of thing, and pull all that stuff from the console, then, well, the developer doesn't really have much of a choice in the matter. Again, a situation of, it sucks, but at least you can understand what's going on there. But then there's the real elephant in the room, the games that have really no business being online only, and yet the developers or publishers just shut the games down and remove them from sale, and once they shut them down, nobody can play them whether they have single player or not. Looking at games like Darkspore or The Crew or something along those lines, where they clearly have some form of single player. In fact, Darkspore is almost exclusively single player, and yet instead of patching the game so it no longer has to connect to those servers so you can still keep playing the game you purchased, they say, no, we're just going to shut it down, and suddenly nobody's able to play the game anymore. Like I said, these games have absolutely no business being online only. The fact that they were designed that way strikes me as openly malicious on the part of especially the publishers, but also to some degree the developers. Again, I can understand if it's an entirely multiplayer game that is entirely dependent on server infrastructure and such, and they just can't really justify the cost of maintaining that anymore. But there is absolutely no reason whatsoever for especially a single-player only game, but even just a primarily single-player game, to suddenly become inaccessible either because your internet goes out and it can't connect to the servers, or the company decides to shut down those servers and thus the game becomes unplayable. If you can play the game by yourself, or it has local multiplayer in the sense that you can play it over local network or split screen or something like that, then anyone who purchases a copy of that game should still be able to play all of those modes. There is no reason whatsoever to have all that stuff anchored to online servers that the company can just shut down whenever they feel like it and suddenly make the game inaccessible. Again, I consider that an openly malicious practice, and publishers especially, but also developers who partake in that are, as far as I'm concerned, absolutely no different than thieves when they shut those games down. Pulling the game from sale is one thing. They're well within their rights to do that, as annoying as it is. But tying single player and local multiplayer to the online component when there's absolutely no reason they need to be tied to that, and thus when that infrastructure is ultimately shut down, the entire game becomes completely unplayable for people who bought the game in the first place, that is absolute scum behavior, and they should not only be ashamed of it, as far as I'm concerned, they should be considered criminals for it. Oh, and speaking of scum behavior, the whole bit about Epic delisting all of the Unreal games and Unreal Tournament games. First, Epic made it abundantly clear they haven't cared about the Unreal franchise in a very long time at this point, because Fortnite exists and makes them ridiculous amounts of money, so why would they care? That said, I can at least see why they would shut down support for the multiplayer of Unreal Tournament 3. It was never especially popular to begin with, even though they said they were going to do Unreal Tournament 3X or something along those lines, which was supposedly going to make the game free to play and also overhaul its online infrastructure, but then they just quietly purged all information from that from their website, so they've made it pretty abundantly clear they have completely abandoned the Unreal franchise and only consider it for the name of their engine at this point. Although, honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if they just stop calling it the Unreal Engine and start calling it the Fortnite Engine or some bullshit like that. To put it simply, they had absolutely no reason whatsoever to delist, especially Unreal 1 and 2, because those are almost exclusively single-player games anyway. But even the rest of the series played just fine in single-player, so there was no reason for them to delist those either. The only one they can kind of justify is Unreal Tournament 3, because it still had that account system associated with it, but it was still able to be played offline even with the janky account system, so there wasn't even really a need for them to delist that one either. But even though there was really no reason for them to delist all of them, they did it anyway because Epic is a terrible company and are frankly only getting worse as time goes on. No, I'm not bitter about this whole thing at all. It's not like Unreal Tournament 99 and 2004 are a couple of my favorite first-person shooters or anything. Couldn't possibly be the case. But anyway, yeah, Epic is a terrible company, and I wasn't really surprised that they were delisting them, but it's still just obnoxious and yet another reason for me to dislike them. But as for the whole delisting having a negative impact on the industry, of course it's going to have a negative impact on it, especially when we get more and more of these live service games that inevitably get shut down and become inaccessible. As more and more of these games become online only, we are going to start seeing more and more of them become not only completely inaccessible, but basically lost to gaming history. We've already long had concerns about preserving things like MMOs, but when everything becomes online only and it becomes incredibly difficult to start preserving even just single-player games, yeah, that's all going to start getting real nasty. So ultimately what we need to do to see this not become the grim dark future where no gaming history is preserved at all, then we really need to see more consumer protections being pushed into the gaming industry so that if you purchase a game, you're able to play it as long as you have hardware and software that is capable of running it, regardless of whether the company that made the game still maintains its online infrastructure or not. So if you just want to hop into a game and play its single-player component, or play local multiplayer on the couch with your buddies, then you should be able to do that for every single game you purchase. Period. End of story. And any developer or publisher who argues otherwise is full of shit. Anyway, now that I've ranted a bit about that, let me move on to a question that's considerably less charged, which is my thoughts on E3 being cancelled indefinitely. Well, on the one hand, it's a bit of a shame to see something that was an institution in gaming for so long come to an end, but on the other hand, it was bloated and poorly managed, so I'm not really sorry to see it gone, and more importantly, we still have the same effective results with all of the direct conferences from the publishers themselves, and of course especially when you get to the Game Awards at the end of the year, and it's basically just a glorified advertisement reel with a few very brief awards thrown in here and there. So yeah, is E3 really gone or just changed? I'll let you be the judge of that. Anyway, moving on to the next question. Machine Games is developing an Indiana Jones game, which we now know is Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. When this question was submitted, I don't think they had revealed the title yet, actually. But do you think they would do a good job, or would it fall into the same problems that their Wolfenstein reboots have? I have no hope whatsoever for Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, but it will certainly be interesting seeing what kind of a train wreck it turns into. Oh, and before anybody asks, no, I have not seen Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, and I have absolutely no desire to. That's not to say that I will absolutely never watch it, but I have absolutely no plans to right now. Anyway, moving on to the next question. Why aren't there any FPS games set during the Korean War? It feels completely forgotten and overshadowed by World War II and Vietnam. Funny you should mention the word forgotten specifically, because the Korean War is often referred to as the Forgotten War, precisely because it's not just in video games, but also in movies, TV, in academia. It is often completely glossed over. And I think a lot of that is because it was a war without a definitive conclusion. It's technically still ongoing today. A lot of people don't realize this, but the Korean War never actually ended. It had an armistice signed that ceased the actual fighting part of it, But there's never actually been a peace treaty signed that would bring a definitive end to the hostilities. North and South Korea are technically still at war to this day. Meanwhile, you look at World War II and you have pretty definitive good and bad guys, at least in the sense that most of the allies, with the exception of the Soviet Union, were effectively the good guys, while it seems like the Axis powers were pretty much in a competition to see who could commit the worst atrocities. And since it was such a massive war with such profound effects on the world after, it stands to reason that you'd get a lot of media covering it. And of course, the Vietnam War is this odd cultural wound in the US's history that's never really going to heal. And while a lot of people will say that it was the US's first major loss in a conflict, I would like to remind people that the US technically didn't lose the Vietnam War. It's more like the military was completely hamstrung by the bureaucrats and politicians back home at every conceivable opportunity, because they were afraid that if the US committed to the war and actually invaded North Vietnam, like would be required to actually win the war, then that might spark a full-scale conflict with the Soviet Union, and needless to say, back in the 60s, that was an absolutely terrifying prospect. And between that meaning the US basically wasn't allowing itself to win the war, and the fact that public sentiment back home was so severely anti-Vietnam War, the US pulled its troops out of the region, the South Vietnamese regime collapsed, and it was counted as a loss for the US, even though they technically more just gave up on it than anything else. Thus, everybody who fought in the Vietnam War effectively did so for nothing, and when they got back, the initial public response to them returning was that they were all monsters, that they were all war criminals, and so on and so forth, and thus you end up with this cultural wound on the American psyche that to this day has never really healed and probably never will. And sandwiched in between these two massive influences on American culture, you have the Korean War, which didn't really affect much outside of the Korean peninsula, and ultimately remains unresolved to this day. And while military history aficionados certainly find it a very interesting conflict, the vast majority of people out there really don't know anything about it, and thus there's not really public drive for a first-person shooter set in the Korean War. So barring a sudden massive public interest in the Korean War, I highly doubt we're really going to see a first-person shooter, at least a major one anyway, set in the Korean War. Which is a shame, because Vietnam first-person shooters and just Vietnam games in general tend to be crap, and World War II is so overdone at this point that I can't muster any interest in it anymore. So a first-person shooter set in the Korean War would definitely be a massive breath of fresh air. Anyway, let's move on to the next question, which is, Starfield has noticeably been having a critical backlash from gamers and critics reevaluating Bethesda as a whole. Do you see it as the big turning point for Bethesda game studios? Why or why not? I don't know about Starfield being the turning point. I really think that Fallout 76 was the turning point there. But with Starfield, I don't think anybody can really deny it anymore. Bethesda hasn't actually made a truly good game since Morrowind, and that was, at the time I'm making this video, over 2 decades ago. Ever since then, it has been nothing but a continual decline in quality for Bethesda's games, and people are finally, after way too long as far as I'm concerned, waking up to that fact. The thing is that while people are waking up to the fact that Bethesda's quality has been declining, a lot of them aren't willing to admit it for anything other than Fallout 76 and Starfield yet. So we really don't know yet whether we've actually passed the proper turning point for people actually realizing what's going on at Bethesda Game Studios, or whether people will just consider Fallout 76 and Starfield as just one-off mistakes, and then when Elder Scrolls 6 rolls around, they're going to start acting like Bethesda's the best thing ever again, even if Elder Scrolls 6 inevitably turns out to be terrible. So we'll just have to wait and see on that, but I might be surprised and find out that this was exactly the push Bethesda needed to actually make improvements to their company, and thus when Elder Scrolls 6 rolls around, it's actually a significant improvement, but I'm not going to hold my breath there. Now we're going to move on to a few questions from JDOS400. I know you've said in the past that you hate grinding in video games, but why is that fine in a game like Stardew Valley and not other game genres? Well, the thing is that while you can technically say the gameplay loop of something like Stardew Valley is a grind, frankly, if you consider it a grind, you're playing the game wrong. These kinds of games are meant to be laid-back experiences that you go through at your own pace. The only real hard limits on things are that occasionally you might need to upgrade some of your equipment in order to progress a bit further in certain areas, and you have a time limit on the amount of things you can accomplish in a single day. But neither of those are a particularly big deal. If you can't progress in a certain area because you don't have the particular equipment upgrade you need to go any further, then just go do something else until you get enough resources to get whatever upgrade you need and then progress further in that one specific area. A lot of people get caught up in that daily time limit and think that they need to optimize their play and thus grind out certain things very quickly, but you really don't. You may well have a time limit to accomplish things within a specific day, but there's no time limit for anything overall. You can just accomplish everything at your own pace, and there's no pressure to grind anything out. Meanwhile, you go over to other types of games, particularly stuff like JRPGs and MMOs, and you'll hit what I will describe as the grind wall, where you'll start running into enemies that have considerably higher stats than your party does, and thus you just aren't really capable of dealing with those particular enemies. Thus, you have to stop progressing further into the game and just go back and grind out some levels so you have the stats to deal with whatever the game is throwing at you. In games like that, you don't really have a choice if you want to progress further into the game and see more of the story. If you hit the grind wall, you need to grind in order to surpass the grind wall in order to get to the other stuff that you were actually wanting to do. In a game like Stardew Valley, on the other hand, if you hit a barrier in one particular activity, then it's only a barrier in that one particular activity. It's not going to stop you from doing all the other activities you have access to. And so, if you're playing the game properly, instead of just getting hyper fixated on that one activity and just grinding away at it exclusively until you get through it, you take a step back and you say, okay, well, we'll chip away at this gradually, and in the meantime, let's go do other activities, and you can continue progressing in those other activities while you also gradually chip away at whatever requirement you have to progress in that other activity. It becomes a situation where, sure, technically it can be considered a grind, but it definitely doesn't feel like one, because instead of your game coming to a screeching halt like it does in, say, a JRPG with a grind wall, a game like Stardew Valley says, look, this is a game to accomplish at your own pace, so just chill out and try everything that the game has to offer, and if you're doing everything at a very gradual pace, you'll never really hit a proper grind wall in it. So, yeah, that's the big difference there. In games where grinding really drives me up the wall, it's because that grind wall is preventing me from doing the things that I'm actually interested in doing in the first place. In a game like Stardew Valley, on the other hand, the entire point is to just chill out and do these activities at your own pace, so it never really feels like a grind. Next question, do I think the Duke Nukem franchise is truly dead, or will there ever be another game? Well, as long as Gearbox owns it, there will probably never be another Duke Nukem game. That is the simple reality, because they clearly have no interest in the franchise whatsoever. The next question had a bit of preamble that gave some context as to where this question's coming from, but let me go ahead and give you the question first. It's, do I think you should always watch reviews first, not just mine, but other people's as well, before considering purchasing any game? And the explanation for this was that when they find a game that they're interested in, a lot of the times they're not really sure whether the reviewers are right about the game or not until they've played it themselves. The answer to this is going to be fairly simple. Absolutely watch or read reviews before you go to purchase a game. The more informed you are about what it is and what it offers and what kinds of problems it has, the more likely you are to make a good purchasing decision. And you shouldn't just watch or read one review and then call it a day. You should look at multiple perspectives. Find some critics that you find yourself agreeing with on a regular basis and see what they have to say about it. Also, find some critics that you may disagree with on a regular basis and see what they have to say about it. You might still come out of their reviews thinking they're full of crap, but you're still getting more information. It's more perspectives to throw into the information pool that you will ultimately use to make your purchasing decision. The more info you have, the better a purchasing decision you can make. That said, if you end up at an impasse, you read or watch a bunch of reviews and you're still just not really sure whether you want to pick up that particular game or not, check and see if there's a demo. If it has a demo available, give the demo a try, and then maybe you were able to make your decision based off of that. But if the game doesn't have a demo and you're still at an impasse, well, that's where I'd recommend two things. The first is just don't pick the game up at full price regardless, because you're just not sure. The second is give it some time. Give the initial hype time to simmer down, and the developers and publishers time to put out a few patches if it has some technical problems or something along those lines, and then take another look at it. chances are you'll have enough information by that point to be able to make a more confident purchasing decision. Just remember though that at the end of the day, regardless of what other people are saying, it's your time and money. You ultimately decide how you invest said time and money. Reviewers like myself are ultimately just trying to help you not waste said time and money. And now we move on to the final question for this year's Q&A, which is from someone who preferred to remain anonymous, and they were wondering how I feel about what Digital Eclipse is doing with its Gold Master series, starting with The Making of Karateka and Llamasoft's The Jeff Minter Story. So for those of you who don't know what these are, they are described as interactive documentaries, with the idea here being that not only do they include remastered versions of these original, rather old at this point, games, that are able to be played on modern systems without any fuss whatsoever, and include convenience features like rewind or save anywhere and that sort of thing. But they also include a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff, so design documents, concept art, director commentary, even some earlier builds and otherwise prototype versions of what would ultimately become the games that we know today. So not only are you able to play the game itself, but you're also getting the history behind it. It's an idea that they started messing around with when they made Atari 50 a couple of years ago, which is a compilation of Atari games that's handled in a very similar manner. And while I don't have any of these Gold Master series yet, or the Atari 50 yet, I have to say, it is a really cool way of handling these re-releases, and I really hope we see more of this kind of thing in the future. Because, again, just having the full package there with the concept art, development documents, commentaries, the full perspective on the game's development is just really cool seeing that kind of thing, especially in an era where we're increasingly heading towards games that will just disappear once they get shut down because they're always online. So yeah, if you're interested in the history of video games, then definitely check out what Digital Eclipse has been doing, and again, I really hope we see more of that kind of thing in the future. And with that, we come to the end of this year's Q&A. I hope you all enjoyed it or otherwise found it interesting, and if you have questions for next year's Q&A, go ahead and start sending those in, and I'll start getting them put together for next year's Q&A. And of course, if you would prefer to remain anonymous, or there's a particular name you would prefer me to use when crediting the question, then go ahead and let me know that as well. Thank you all very much for watching. Thanks for bearing with me not only until the end of this video, but also while I was making the video. It took a lot longer to put together than I thought it would. And it certainly wasn't helped by all of the technical problems that I've been running into lately, so again, thanks for bearing with me there. And now that the Q&A is done, it's time to get back to the regular schedule, which is basically whatever I happen to be working on at any given point. You'll be seeing reviews, NTOs, DW plays, etc., so definitely stay tuned for all of that as well. If you like what I do, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand, but the option's there if you're interested, and every bit really does help out. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.